The winter didn't just isolate the mountain, it erased it. No roads, no signals, no mercy. A man came here to disappear after the war took everything he thought he was. He brought only his scars, and a K9 who never stopped listening. Then, one night, the wind changed, sound began to lie, and somewhere in the white silence, someone was running out of time. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Hollow Creek, Montana was the kind of town weather didn't merely visit, it governed. In late November, the daylight arrived thin and reluctant, sliding over the Bitterroot foothills like a weak apology before retreating behind slate-colored clouds. Wind combed through the evergreens with a steady bone-level persistence, lifting powder snow into pale spirals that erased tire tracks as soon as they appeared. The highway into town narrowed into 2 lanes, and then into one long, quiet ribbon bordered by pines and fencing, half buried under drifts. Everything here looked like it had learned to endure without complaint. The weathered storefronts, the sagging porches, the distant smoke lines rising from chimneys as if the houses were still breathing. Caleb Rowan arrived on a morning when the temperature hovered well below freezing, and the sky had the flat, metallic sheen of a storm holding its breath. He drove an older pickup with a dented quarter panel and an engine that sounded like it had opinions. There was no moving truck behind him, no convoy, no friends waving from the curb. Just a duffel bag on the passenger seat and a dog in the back whose presence filled the cab more than any human passenger ever could. Briggs was a Belgian Malinois, almost 7 years old, lean, muscled, built like a coiled spring wrapped in short sable fur that darkened along his spine into a near-black saddle. His face was sharp and intelligent, ears tall and alert, eyes the color of amber glass held up to a winter sun. A pale scar cut through the fur above his right shoulder blade. Mace in one ear carried a notch that made him look permanently skeptical. He wore a faded working harness even though no one had asked him to. The harness wasn't vanity, it was identity. In the military, Briggs had been a detector dog and a perimeter partner. Retirement hadn't softened him. It had simply narrowed his world down to what mattered, the man in the front seat and the invisible lines of danger that only Briggs seemed able to read. Caleb looked like someone the cold would have to negotiate with. He was 41, tall and broad through the shoulders, with the thick, functional strength of a body trained to carry weight without ceremony. His hair was dark brown, cut close, not because he cared about style, but because he didn't want anything tugging at him in wind or in memory. A short beard shadowed his jaw, and kept in that in-between state that suggested he stopped noticing the mirror months ago. His eyes were gray-green and steady, the kind strangers mistook for calm. People who knew better would have called it distance, attention held half a step back from the present, as if he was always listening for something that might break. Something had broken years ago in a place he never named out loud anymore. A roadside blast had taken a clean piece of cartilage from his left knee and the full ease of his sleep. It had also taken the part of him that believed a life could be simple if he tried hard enough. Since then, Caleb's personality had become a kind of careful discipline, courteous when required, quiet by default, and bluntly honest in a way that sometimes landed like rudeness. It wasn't that he disliked people. It was that he had learned what words cost when the wrong ones got someone killed. His marriage hadn't ended in screaming. That would have been easier. Mara had left the way Winter left a field, thoroughly, without theatrics, making the absence impossible to ignore. She was the kind of woman who looked warm even when she was angry. Early 40s, tall and long-limbed, with chestnut hair she usually twisted into a loose knot that escaped at the nape by evening. Her skin was fair, freckled across the bridge of her nose and along her forearms, the sort that burned in summer and never quite forgave the sun. Her eyes were soft brown, not timid, observant. Mara was steady, the sort of person who remembered appointments, who fed the dog on time, who asked questions and waited for real answers. She'd been a physical therapist, which meant she believed in repair as a practice, not a wish. For years, she tried to coax Caleb back into ordinary life, the way she guided patients through pain, patient, persistent, hopeful. But there was a particular night, After Caleb woke from a nightmare with his hands clenched like he was still gripping a rifle, when Mara sat on the edge of the bed and spoke as if she'd finally accepted that love wasn't always enough. No accusation, no bitterness, only fatigue that had run out of disguises. "I can't keep living with the version of you that comes home," she said. "I need the one who stays." She packed 2 days later, methodical and quiet. In the kitchen, she left a note written in neat, careful handwriting, as if she were leaving instructions for a stranger. "I'm not angry. I'm just done waiting for you to return from places I can't follow." Caleb folded the note once and set it on the counter. He did not chase her. He'd chased people before. The ones he lost didn't come back. So, when he decided to leave, he did it the way he always did everything hard, quickly, cleanly, with as few witnesses as possible. The house in Montana came from an old listing and a seller who didn't ask questions. A cabin on the edge of Hollow Creek, perched on a ridge that watched the forest and the narrow road like a lone sentry. He paid in full. He didn't tell anyone, except his bank. He did not plan for company. The pickup rolled through Hollow Creek's main street, one diner with a neon sign that flickered like it was tired, a hardware store with snow shovels stacked by the door, watched a gas station where the pumps looked older than Caleb's first deployment. A few bundled figures moved with the slow economy of people who had learned not to waste warmth. No one waved, no one stared. In a place like this, newcomers were noted, not welcomed. Not because the town was unkind, because the town was cautious. Winter punished curiosity. Caleb turned off the main road and followed a narrower lane that climbed, the tires crunching through packed snow. The trees thickened, pines rising dark and vertical, their branches heavy with white. The cabin appeared at last through the trunks, a low, timbered house with a steep roof built for snow load and a porch that faced the valley. It looked sturdier than the online photo had suggested, as if it had been built by someone who expected hardship and refused to be impressed by it. He parked and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. The silence inside the cab was deep enough that he could hear the soft clicking of Briggs's nails as the dog shifted in the back. Briggs let out a single breath, quiet, controlled, then leaned forward, muzzle pressed near the rear window, scanning. His ears pricked toward the tree line, not fear, not excitement, attention, sharpened and deliberate. Caleb opened the door. Cold punched him in the lungs, clean and immediate, a kind of honesty he almost respected. He stepped out, boots sinking into powder. The air smelled like pine sap and distant smoke and the faint mineral bite of snow. Briggs jumped down after him with a smooth, practiced motion. He didn't bound or circle like a pet. He landed, stood, and took inventory. The dog froze, head angled slightly east, and body still as a drawn wire. Caleb followed his gaze. The forest stood motionless, thick with shadow. No animal tracks crossed the fresh snow. No wind shook the branches. And yet, Briggs listened as if something had just spoken. Caleb's throat tightened without permission. "Easy," he murmured, though he didn't know if he meant the dog or himself. Briggs didn't move. He simply kept watch, as if the ridge had rules Caleb hadn't learned yet. Caleb lifted his duffel from the passenger seat and started toward the porch. The boards creaked under his weight, a low complaint swallowed by the wind. He found the key where the seller had said it would be, under a loose stone by the step. The lock turned too easily. The door opened into darkness that smelled not of rot, but of cold wood and old smoke, like a place that had been waiting without needing to announce it. Behind him, Briggs stepped onto the porch and paused, looking once more toward the eastern tree line before crossing the threshold. For the first time since the drive, Caleb felt something shift in the air, subtle, like a pressure change before a storm. He hadn't come here to begin again. He hadn't come here to be found. But as the door clicked shut and the winter pressed itself against the cabin's walls, Caleb Rowan had the uneasy sense that Hollow Creek had already noticed him, and the ridge had not forgotten how to keep watch. Morning came to the ridge without ceremony. There was no sunrise in the way Caleb remembered from gentler places, no warm spill of light, no gradual easing of darkness. Instead, the night thinned reluctantly, replaced by a dull, overcast gray that pressed low against the treetops. Snow had fallen again while he slept, fine and persistent, sealing the cabin into the landscape as if it had always been there and always would be. Caleb woke on the couch with his boots still on and his jacket folded under his head. Old habits had decided for him, before exhaustion took over. His knee ached dully, the familiar reminder that cold never forgot old injuries. For a moment he lay still, listening. Wind slid along the outer walls, testing the seams. The cabin answered with soft, controlled creaks. Nothing loose, nothing panicked. It sounded like a structure that knew how to carry weight. Briggs was already awake. The dog lay near the front door, chest rising slow and steady, amber eyes open and alert. His ears flicked at a sound Caleb didn't register until a second later. The distant crack of ice shifting somewhere downslope. Briggs didn't growl. He simply watched, as if measuring whether the sound belonged or not. Caleb pushed himself upright and rolled his shoulder once to work out the stiffness. The cabin smelled faintly of cold wood and iron, with an undercurrent of old smoke trapped in the beams. He moved through the main room, taking inventory the way he always did in unfamiliar spaces. The furniture was sparse but deliberate. A heavy oak table scarred by years of use, 2 straight-back chairs with repaired legs, a cast-iron stove that looked older than the town itself. Nothing decorative, everything functional. It struck him that whoever built or maintained this place hadn't been interested in comfort so much as survival. He found the kitchen stocked more than expected. Canned goods lined the shelves in neat rows, labels turned outward, flour sealed in tins, salt, coffee, a stack of folded blankets in a cedar chest by the wall. None of it new, but none of it neglected either. Caleb frowned, the expression pulling faint lines deeper around his eyes. He had paid for the property, not its provisions. Either the previous owner had left in a hurry, or had never intended to leave at all. Briggs rose when Caleb moved toward the back door. The dog padded silently at his side, nails clicking only when he stepped onto the worn boards of the porch. Outside, the cold bit harder in daylight, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. The valley below was a study in restraint. Dark green pines dusted white, the narrow road barely visible beneath fresh snow. No movement except the wind bending the upper branches. Caleb crouched and examined the porch. Snow lay smooth except for 2 sets of tracks, his own boots from the night before, and Briggs's precise, economical prints. No others. He followed the edge of the cabin, checking the foundation, the woodpile stacked against the northern wall. The logs were dry, split cleanly, arranged by size. Someone had taken care with this place. That realization sat heavier than neglect would have. They circled back toward the eastern side of the ridge. The forest there seemed denser, the trees growing closer together as if drawn by a shared purpose. Briggs slowed, head lowering slightly, body angling between Caleb and the tree line. His tail remained still, posture relaxed but firm. It was the same stance he'd used on patrol when something didn't belong but hadn't yet declared itself a threat. Caleb stopped. He didn't push forward. Years ago, that instinct, to pause when his partner paused, had saved his life. He trusted it now without questioning why. "All right," he said quietly, more acknowledgement than command. They retreated to the cabin. Inside, Caleb lit the stove, coaxing flame from cold iron with practiced ease. The fire caught slowly, then settled into a steady burn that pushed warmth into the room inch by inch. He brewed coffee on the stovetop, black and bitter, the way he'd learned to drink it overseas. Briggs lay down near the heat, one ear still angled toward the door. By late morning, the weather shifted again. Clouds thickened, lowering until the world outside the windows seemed compressed, flattened. Snow began to fall heavier now, flakes larger and more deliberate, as if the sky had committed to the task. Caleb pulled on his jacket and stepped back onto the porch, scanning the road below. That was when he saw the truck. It crawled along the lane with the careful persistence of someone who knew the mountain could punish impatience. An older model pickup, Forest Service green, chains rattling softly against the tires. It stopped near the base of the ridge. The engine idled for a moment before cutting out. A door opened, then another, the sound carried thinly uphill by the wind. Briggs was on his feet instantly, not aggressive, curious, alert. Caleb rested a hand briefly against the dog's shoulder, while revealing the controlled tension beneath the fur. The man who started up the path moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned to respect uneven ground. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, tall but slightly stooped, as if years of wind had pressed him forward inch by inch. A thick gray beard framed a face carved by weather rather than age. Deep lines set around pale blue eyes that missed very little. He wore a heavy ranger's coat, faded to a muted green-brown, patched at the elbows, and gloves that had seen more winters than Caleb cared to count. When he reached the porch, the man removed his hat, a wool cap pulled low over iron-gray hair, and nodded once, polite but not deferential. His gaze flicked briefly to Briggs, assessing, then back to Caleb. "Name's Thomas Hale," he said. His voice was low, roughened by cold and years of speaking into wind. "Most folks call me Tom. I look after this stretch of land when the weather lets me." Caleb studied him in return. Tom Hale carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being listened to, not because he demanded it, but because experience had taught others that ignoring him was unwise. His posture suggested an old injury, perhaps a shoulder that never quite healed, but his movements were steady. "Caleb Rowan," Caleb replied. He didn't offer a handshake. Tom didn't seem offended. "Didn't expect anyone up here this early in the season," Tom said, glancing at the sky. "Road's gonna be unreliable for a few days at least." "I noticed," Caleb said. Tom's eyes softened just slightly. "That dog yours?" "He is." "Good dog," Tom said, not as flattery, but as observation. Briggs met his gaze without hostility, ears forward. After a moment, Tom nodded, satisfied. "This cabin's been empty a while. Belongs to the county technically, but no one's bothered with it since before my time." Caleb frowned. "I bought it." Tom didn't argue. He only shrugged. "Paperwork does what paperwork does. I'm just here to make sure no one freezes to death without someone knowing about it." The wind picked up then, rattling the porch rail. Snow swirled harder, visibility dropping. Tom looked back down the path, then at Caleb again. "Storm's coming in fast. If you're staying, you'll want to stay put." Caleb glanced at the door behind him, at the fire burning steadily inside. He hadn't planned beyond arrival, hadn't planned for visitors or warnings, or a cabin that seemed to know more about winter than he did. I'm staying," he said. Tom nodded once, as if he'd expected that answer. "Then keep your light on after dark. Sound carries wrong up here when the weather turns. Folks get turned around. Happens more than it should." With that, he pulled his hat back on and started down the path, his figure quickly swallowed by falling snow. Caleb stood on the porch long after the truck engine faded. The wind howled along the ridge, pressing its cold insistence against the cabin's walls. Behind him, Briggs sat, steady and watchful, facing the eastern tree line. Caleb closed the door and latched it. The fire crackled. Outside, winter tightened its grip. And for the first time since leaving everything behind, Caleb understood that staying here would not mean being left alone. The storm settled in with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be. By the second night, the ridge felt sealed off from the rest of Montana, the road below erased into a pale suggestion that might have been a memory rather than a route. Snow pressed against the windows in soft, persistent taps, and the wind learned the cabin's shape quickly, sliding along the walls, testing corners, circling back on itself like it was searching for a weakness. Caleb adjusted to the rhythm the way he had learned to adjust to most hostile environments, methodically, without complaint. He rationed the firewood without counting it aloud, rotated canned food forward, kept the radio on at low volume, even when it delivered nothing but static. Silence, he had learned, was more dangerous when it came unannounced. Briggs adapted faster. That the dog mapped the cabin in hours, memorizing the range of each window, the line of sight to the door, the exact place where the floorboards creaked loudest. He slept in short, efficient intervals, always positioning himself where he could see both Caleb and the outside world. His movements were quiet, economical. There was nothing anxious in him, only readiness, honed and patient. On the third evening, something changed. Caleb noticed it first through sound, not sight. The wind shifted direction, subtle but decisive, turning eastward. The pitch of it altered, lowering slightly as if the air itself had thickened. Snow continued to fall, but the way it struck the cabin felt different, less direct. When a branch cracked somewhere in the forest, the noise arrived late, stretched thin, as though it had taken the long way around. The Briggs lifted his head. One ear angled toward the eastern tree line. The other remained fixed on the door. His body did not tense fully. Instead, it held a careful neutrality that Caleb recognized from patrols when terrain interfered with perception. Not danger yet, but deception. Caleb stood and moved to the window. The world beyond the glass looked unchanged. Trees heavy with snow, darkness pressed close, no movement he could see. He opened the door a few inches. Cold surged in immediately, sharp and invasive. The wind carried sound oddly, folding it back on itself. When Caleb clapped his hands once, the echo returned distorted and late, arriving from a direction it should not have. He closed the door slowly. Years ago, in a narrow valley half a world away, Caleb had learned that disorientation did not announce itself as panic. It came as doubt, a second of hesitation where certainty should have been, a feeling that the ground itself had shifted its allegiance. He poured a cup of coffee and didn't drink it. Instead, he sat at the oak table and listened. Briggs moved closer, sitting at his left knee, close enough that Caleb could feel the warmth of him through heavy fabric. The dog's presence was grounding, a steady point in a world that seemed determined to blur its edges. Near midnight, the radio crackled, not the usual static, but a broken fragment of a voice, clipped and swallowed before it could form words. Caleb leaned forward, adjusting the dial with careful precision. Nothing followed. He shut the radio off before the silence could sharpen into something worse. Sleep came in shallow layers. He dreamed of hallways that narrowed as he walked, hoary walls pressing in without touching, the air thick with unplaceable echoes. When he woke, Briggs was awake too, eyes reflecting the faint glow of the dying fire. Just before dawn, Caleb found the notebook. It was tucked into a narrow cupboard near the back of the cabin, hidden behind a stack of folded tarps and a coil of rope stiff with age. The cover was leather, darkened and worn smooth at the edges, the pages inside thick and yellowed but intact. The handwriting was precise, spare, slanted slightly to the right, as if the writer had no patience for wasted motion. The name on the inside cover read, Evelyn Moore. Caleb didn't recognize it. The entries were dated irregularly, spanning years rather than months. There were no reflections, no personal confessions, only observations, wind direction, and temperature shifts. It notes on how sound carried, or failed to. Diagrams of the ridge, marked with arrows and shaded areas labeled simply, false ground, thin ice, echo drift. One line appeared again and again, underlined with firm insistence. Do not trust your ears when the wind comes from the east. Caleb closed the notebook and exhaled slowly. Whoever Evelyn Moore had been, she had not lived here by accident, and she had not written this for comfort. By late morning, the storm eased just enough for visibility to return in fragments. Caleb pulled on his jacket and stepped outside with Briggs at his side. The air felt wrong, thinner, unsettled. He followed the ridgeline cautiously, keeping the cabin within sight. The eastern edge drew Briggs's attention immediately. The dog slowed, nose working, paws placing carefully. They reached a shallow dip in the ground, where snow had settled too smoothly, unbroken by drift or shadow. Briggs stopped and sat abruptly, blocking Caleb's path. He did not look back. Caleb extended a long branch and tested the surface ahead. The snow collapsed inward with a hollow sound, revealing a dark pocket beneath. One more step and he would have broken through into nothing solid at all. All right, Caleb murmured again, a dry edge of humor cutting through the tension. He stepped back. Briggs rose and resumed his place at Caleb's side, satisfied. They were heading back when movement caught Caleb's eye down near the road. A figure struggled along the buried lane, progress slow and uneven. As they drew closer, Caleb recognized the shape of a man pushing against the wind with stubborn determination. The man introduced himself as Ethan Rourke, early 30s, lean to the point of gauntness, with a sharp nose reddened by cold and dark stubble that suggested days without proper rest. His hair was black and plastered to his head by snowmelt beneath a knit cap. His eyes were alert but tired, the kind of tired that came from responsibility rather than sleep deprivation. I was supposed to be through here yesterday, Ethan said, voice rough. Truck slid off the logging road. I walked the rest. Caleb led him to the cabin without commentary. Inside, Ethan thawed slowly, hands wrapped around a mug, shoulders slumping as warmth returned. He worked for a survey crew out of a neighboring county. Mapping land before winter shut everything down. Underprepared, overconfident, Not careless, just human. I heard about a place up on the ridge," Ethan said after a while, glancing toward the window. "Light sometimes stays on. Figured it was worth a try." Caleb didn't correct him. He marked the road conditions on a scrap of paper and showed Ethan where not to walk if the wind turned east. Ethan listened closely, nodding, gratitude written plainly across his face. When the man left that afternoon, the storm held its distance. Caleb stood on the porch and watched him go until the road swallowed him again. He turned back inside, eyes drawn to the notebook resting open on the table. That night, Caleb set a lantern in the front window and left it burning, not bright enough to announce itself recklessly. Just steady, just there. Briggs lay by the door, chin on his paws, ears tuned to the shifting wind. Outside, the forest rearranged its sounds, bending them into unfamiliar shapes. Inside, the cabin held fast, fire steady, light unwavering. Caleb sat at the table with Evelyn Moore's notebook open before him and understood, with a clarity that left no room for argument, that this place had not been built for hiding. It had been built for noticing, and now that he had noticed it in return, the ridge would not let him pretend otherwise. The wind returned before dusk, not louder than before, but heavier, as if it carried intention rather than weather. Snow began falling again in wide, deliberate sheets that erased distance and depth at the same time, turning the ridge into a narrow island of certainty surrounded by white nothing. The lantern in the window burned steadily, its light muted by frost on the glass, but visible all the same, a small, stubborn presence against the dark. Caleb had just finished securing the shutters when Briggs stiffened near the door. This time, it was different from the earlier alerts. The dog did not simply listen. His body angled forward, weight shifting onto his front paws, breath slow but deliberate. A low sound rolled out of his chest, not a growl, not a bark, but something older, shaped by instinct rather than training. It was the sound Briggs made only when something living was running out of time. Caleb didn't hesitate. He pulled on his coat, checked the headlamp, clipped a short line to Briggs's harness without thinking. The wind cut hard as soon as he opened the door, stealing heat and sound alike. Snow stung his eyes, blurring the world into motion and shadow. Briggs surged forward, confident and precise, choosing a path that looked wrong to the eye but felt right underfoot. They moved into the trees where sound bent and returned late, where the ground lied convincingly beneath a smooth white surface. Caleb let Briggs lead, trusting the dog's diagonal course and sudden stops. His knee protested with sharp, familiar pain, but he ignored it. Pain was a language he understood. They found the boy beneath a fallen spruce, all half buried where drifting snow had piled deep against the trunk. He couldn't have been more than 12, small for his age, narrow-shouldered, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by melted snow. His jacket, too thin for the weather, bright blue and modern, was torn along one sleeve, exposing skin burned raw by wind and cold. His lips were tinged blue, breath shallow and uneven. Briggs dropped beside him immediately, pressing his full weight along the boy's side, amber eyes softening as his body radiated heat. Caleb knelt, movements controlled and efficient. He cleared the airway, checked for injuries, found a pulse, weak but steady. Relief came sharp and brief. There would be time for it later. "Stay with me," Caleb said, voice low and firm, pitched not for comfort but for anchoring. And he shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around the boy, shielding him from the wind while Briggs stayed close, unmoving. The climb back to the cabin was slow and punishing. Caleb carried most of the weight, adjusting his grip each time his knee threatened to buckle. Briggs stayed close, correcting course when the storm tried to mislead, stopping when the ground ahead thinned into dangerous suggestion. By the time the cabin came into view, the lantern light blurred through snow. Caleb's breath burned in his chest, and his hands shook from cold and effort. Inside, warmth returned cautiously. Caleb stripped wet layers, layered blankets, careful not to shock cold skin with sudden heat. The boy coughed, a thin, fragile sound, and Caleb allowed himself one controlled breath of relief. When the boy's eyes finally fluttered open, they were brown and unfocused, tracking Briggs first before settling on Caleb's face. "My name's Noah," the boy whispered, voice barely audible. "Noah Parker." Caleb nodded once. "You're safe," he said. "I'm Caleb. That's Briggs." Briggs lifted his head at the sound of his name, tail thumping once against the floor before he settled again, patient and present. Noah's fingers tightened in the thick fur at Briggs's chest, as if anchoring himself to the only solid thing left in the world. The story came in fragments as Noah warmed. He'd been camping with his father along a frozen tributary east of Hollow Creek, a trip meant to be a last adventure before winter fully closed in. His father, Daniel Parker, was a man in his early 40s by Noah's description, tall, broad, with a trim beard and a voice that carried authority easily. Daniel worked construction and trusted his strength too much, believing preparation could always make up for risk. When the weather turned and the snow came sideways, they had argued. Daniel went to find help, telling Noah to stay put. The footprints vanished faster than Noah could follow them. Panic bent every sound, every direction wrong. Caleb listened without interruption. He recognized the cadence of fear, the way it fractured time. When Noah slept at last, color returning unevenly to his cheeks, Caleb marked the perimeter outside with cloth strips tied to branches, bright against the white, so the path would not disappear again. Near dawn, engines cut through the storm like a promise. A snowmobile crested the rise below the cabin, followed by another, their headlights slicing through drifting snow. A man jumped off the first machine before it fully stopped. Daniel Parker looked exactly like Noah had described him. He was broad-shouldered, his beard dark and untrimmed now, eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion and guilt. Snow crusted his jacket, and his movements were sharp, driven by adrenaline that hadn't yet learned it could let go. When he saw Noah standing in the doorway wrapped in blankets, Daniel crossed the distance in seconds and dropped to his knees, arms locking around his son with a force that trembled. Behind him stood a woman in a heavy parka, Lena Parker, Noah's aunt. Shorter than Daniel, with cropped blonde hair and a face worn by worry rather than age. She held herself together with visible effort, one hand pressed to her mouth as she watched, eyes shining. Caleb stepped back, giving them space. Yes, he had learned when to step out of moments that were not his to hold. Daniel rose eventually, his gratitude clumsy and fierce. He shook Caleb's hand too hard, then loosened his grip, embarrassed. "You saved his life," he said, voice breaking despite himself. Caleb shook his head once. "Your son stayed alive," he replied. "That mattered most." Daniel's gaze dropped to Briggs, who sat calmly at Caleb's side. He crouched and rested his forehead briefly against the dog's neck, a gesture raw and unguarded. Briggs accepted it without fuss, tail moving once. When they left, the storm eased as if conceding the point. The engines faded. Silence returned, different now, less oppressive, more attentive. That evening, Caleb added another lantern to the porch and refilled the fuel. He restocked blankets near the door and set a pot of soup to simmer, leaving it there even after he realized he wasn't hungry. Briggs lay by the threshold, ears tuned to the wind. Caleb sat at the table, Evelyn Moore's notebook open before him, and understood the shape of what he'd stepped into. This place did not ask for heroics. It asked for presence, for someone who would notice when sound lied, when ground deceived, when a light needed to be left on. Outside, winter still ruled. Inside, the cabin held steady, and somewhere beyond the ridge, a boy slept alive because two creatures, one scarred man and one disciplined dog, had chosen not to turn away. The morning after the rescue arrived thin and pale, as if the storm had scraped the sky down to its bare essentials. Snow lay everywhere in careful, unbroken layers, softening edges and muting sound. The ridge looked calm in the way mountains often did after violence, composed, almost indifferent, as though nothing of consequence had happened at all. Caleb woke before dawn, habit again. The fire had burned down to embers, warmth lingering in the room like a held breath. Briggs lay by the door, chin on his paws, eyes open. He had not slept much. Caleb could tell by the set of his shoulders and the way his ears tracked even the smallest shifts in air. The dog's discipline had always been impressive. Now it felt essential. Caleb brewed coffee and stood at the window while it cooled, watching the forest. The eastern tree line looked no different than it had the day before. Dark trunks, snow-heavy branches, no obvious threat. And yet, the memory of the ground giving way beneath the branch, the way sound had folded back on itself, lingered like a bruise. The ridge did not forget quickly. It stored mistakes. By mid-morning, the road below began to show signs of life. Not traffic, just the suggestion of it. A distant engine, then nothing. A radio voice carried faintly on the wind and vanished. Caleb pulled on his jacket and stepped outside with Briggs, making a slow circuit of the cabin. He retied the cloth markers he had placed the night before, reinforcing the path with deliberate care. He added a second line along the safer approach, marking the place where the ground had lied. The work steadied him. He did not think about why he was doing it. Then he simply did it. It was near noon when the horse appeared. Caleb heard it before he saw it. A soft, rhythmic crunch of hooves where there should have been none. Briggs lifted his head, ears forward, posture alert but calm. The sound came from the lower trail, where the road narrowed and trees closed in. A moment later, a chestnut gelding stepped into view, steam rising from its nostrils in slow, steady plumes. The horse was big, easily 16 hands, with a thick winter coat the color of burned copper, and a pale blaze running down his face. His mane was untrimmed, tangled with bits of snow and burrs, but his tack was well kept. He moved carefully, favoring his left foreleg just enough to be noticeable. A rider sat deep in the saddle, posture straight despite the terrain. She dismounted a few yards from the porch, moving with the controlled grace of someone who had learned balance the hard way. June Hollis was in her early 40s, tall and lean, her build wiry rather than soft. Her hair, dark blonde threaded heavily with gray, was pulled into a low braid that rested against the back of her parka. Her face was lined, not by age so much as by endurance, eyes sharp, assessing, set beneath brows that suggested she missed very little. A faint scar traced the edge of her jaw, half hidden when she turned her head. "You the man on the ridge?" she asked, voice steady, unadorned. "I live here," Caleb replied. He didn't offer more. He rarely did. June nodded once, accepting that boundary without testing it. Her gaze dropped to Briggs, who stood beside Caleb, relaxed but attentive. The horse flicked an ear toward the dog, then settled, yet calm in a way that suggested long familiarity with working animals. "That your K9?" June asked. "Yes." "Good," she said. "Then you'll understand why I followed the light." June introduced herself as former search and rescue. She spoke the words without ceremony, as if they belonged to a past life she carried lightly but did not deny. Years ago, a call had gone wrong. Weather shifted faster than forecast, sound bent, bearings failed. They'd found the subject alive, then lost him again when the ground gave way. June had been the one holding the rope when it snapped. She didn't say that part out loud, but it lived in the way her hands stilled when she spoke, in the careful precision of her movements. "The ridge has a reputation," she said, glancing east. "Most folks don't know why, they just know not to trust it." Caleb led her inside. The cabin seemed to adjust to her presence easily, as if it had been waiting for people who knew how to listen. June shrugged off her gloves and warmed her hands at the stove. The horse, Ash, 8 years old by her estimate, steady and patient despite the limp, was tied securely near the porch, head lowered, unconcerned. They talked in pieces. June noticed the cloth markers immediately, the lanterns, the notebook open on the table. She did not ask permission before reading a page, but she did not linger either. When she looked up, her eyes were thoughtful rather than surprised. "Someone knew this place," she said, "knew it well enough to leave instructions instead of warnings." Caleb nodded. He hadn't known how to put that into words. June stayed long enough to drink coffee and leave a small canvas bag on the table. But inside were medical supplies, bandages, thermal packs, a compact weather radio with a cracked casing. "You'll use these," she said, "if you haven't already." When she left, Ash stepped carefully down the trail, June moving with him, matching his pace. Caleb watched until they disappeared into the trees. The afternoon passed quietly. Briggs patrolled the perimeter at intervals, stopping at the same points each time, nose low, ears reading shifts Caleb could not hear. At dusk, the wind turned east again. The cabin creaked, not in protest, but in acknowledgement. The radio crackled shortly after dark. This time, the voice held. "Anyone copy? 3 hikers overdue, last contact near the east spur, visibility dropping." Caleb did not answer immediately. He checked Briggs, who was already on his feet, posture intent. He turned to the notebook. It found the shaded area marked Echo Drift, then to the lantern burning steadily in the window. He keyed the mic. "This is the Ridge Cabin," he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, not hesitant, not resigned. Present. "I'm here." The response came fast, relief cutting through the static. Coordinates followed. Caleb repeated them back, steady and precise. He clipped the line to Briggs's harness and pulled on his coat. Outside, the night pressed close, sound bending at the edges. Snow began to fall again, not yet heavy, but purposeful. Caleb paused at the threshold, one hand on the doorframe, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his palm. He thought of Noah's grip on Briggs's fur, of Daniel Parker's shaking hands, of June's quiet resolve. He stepped out and closed the door behind him, leaving the lantern burning. The ridge took him in without comment, wind shifting, forest listening. Briggs moved ahead, confident and sure. Somewhere beyond the trees, people were losing their way. Caleb did not announce a decision. He did not name a calling. He simply followed the dog into the dark, understanding at last that staying was not the opposite of leaving. It was the work that came after. The night closed in fast, the kind of darkness that did not wait for permission. Snow thickened as Caleb and Briggs moved away from the cabin, lantern light shrinking behind them until it was nothing more than a memory held in the corner of the eye. The ridge swallowed sound first, then distance. What remained was the narrow truth of breath, footing, and the dark shape ahead that knew where it was going. Briggs worked without hesitation. His body language shifted into something precise and economical, head low, ears reading currents of air that Caleb could not feel. The line between them stayed slack but alive, a quiet conversation carried through tension and release. Caleb followed, placing his boots where Briggs had already decided the ground would hold. The coordinates from the radio led them toward the eastern spur, but not directly. Briggs cut across the slope at an angle that felt wrong to human logic, avoiding hollows disguised by smooth snow and skirting areas where sound echoed too cleanly. Caleb trusted the pattern. Trust had been earned the hard way years ago, when hesitation cost more than bruises. They found the first hiker clinging to a fir tree just as the wind shifted again. He was a man in his late 20s, tall but poorly insulated, his jacket soaked through and rimed with ice. His beard was patchy and frost-stiff, dark hair plastered to his forehead beneath a hood that had lost its shape. His name was Aaron Pike, a graduate student by his own shaky introduction. Pride bruised harder than his body. He had tried to keep moving when the others couldn't. He had walked in circles instead. Briggs approached first, and stopping just within reach, presence steady and non-threatening. Aaron sagged when he saw the dog, fingers digging into fur like a lifeline. Caleb anchored him, checked for injuries, wrapped him in an emergency blanket. Aaron's speech was slurred but coherent. Hypothermia, early stages, manageable. "Stay here," Caleb said, tying a marker cloth to the tree above Aaron's head. "We're not done." They found the second hiker less than 100 yards away, though it felt farther. Lena Morales was sitting in the snow, back against a rock outcrop, one leg stretched awkwardly in front of her. She was in her early 30s, compact and muscular, with dark hair braided tight against her scalp in a style meant for movement. Her jaw was clenched against pain, eyes bright with the effort of staying present. "Ankle," she said before Caleb could ask. "No, went sideways. I can't put weight on it." Caleb knelt, palpated carefully. Swelling already visible beneath her boot. A bad sprain, maybe worse, but not catastrophic. He stabilized it, layered insulation, and spoke calmly while Briggs lay down beside her, pressing his weight along her legs to keep heat in. "There's one more," Lena said through clenched teeth. She stopped talking about 10 minutes ago. They found the third hiker farther downslope, nearly invisible against the snow. Maya Chen looked younger than the others, early 20s, slender, her face pale beneath wind-burned skin. She had sunk into the drift and stopped trying to get out, exhaustion dragging her inward. Her eyes fluttered when Caleb spoke, unfocused, breath shallow. The moment hovered on a dangerous edge. Briggs moved in close, lying full length against her side, firm and grounding. His presence changed the rhythm of her breathing almost immediately. Caleb worked fast, efficient, hands sure despite the cold biting through his gloves. He talked continuously, not encouragement, not reassurance, but orientation. Name, time, place. The simple truths that tethered a drifting mind. Extraction took everything they had. Caleb made the decision quickly. He called it in, voice clipped and precise, relaying condition and location. Help was on the way, but distance and weather were not negotiable. He fashioned a drag sled from spare rope and a broken trekking pole, loading Maya first, then stabilizing Lena as best he could. Aaron, shivering but mobile, stayed close, guided by Briggs whenever Caleb needed both hands. By the time they reached the cabin, the lantern burned like a promise kept. Inside, the space filled with breath and movement, and the sharp smell of snow melting off fabric. Caleb stripped wet layers, managed heat carefully, set soup on the stove. He worked with a calm that came not from lack of fear, but from familiarity with stakes. Briggs moved among them with quiet purpose, sitting close without crowding, correcting panic with presence alone. Rescue arrived an hour later. Snowmobiles, hard light, clipped voices. Among them was Deputy Mark Ellison, mid-40s, thick-set, with a heavy mustache and eyes that carried the weight of too many winter calls. He took in the scene with professional efficiency, nodding once at Caleb. "Good work," he said, and meant it. When the cabin finally emptied, silence returned in pieces rather than all at once. Then Caleb sank into a chair at the table, hands wrapped around a cooling mug. His knee throbbed now, the pain delayed but insistent. Briggs lay at his feet, exhausted but alert, tail flicking once when Caleb rested a hand against his neck. Later, when the storm eased, June returned. She arrived on Ash again, posture stiff with cold and concern. Her eyes took inventory the moment she stepped inside. Extra blankets used, soup gone, markers disturbed and retied. She said nothing at first, then she exhaled slowly, something like relief softening the hard lines of her face. "You answered the call," she said. Caleb shrugged. They needed a place to stop. June studied him for a long moment. "That's what it always starts as." She stayed long enough to help restock supplies, her movements efficient, practiced. When she left, she paused at the door. "The ridge doesn't let go once it's chosen," she said quietly. "You know that now." Caleb didn't argue. That night, he stood on the porch with Briggs at his side, watching clouds tear open to reveal a thin scatter of stars. The lantern glowed behind them, steady and unremarkable. Somewhere down the mountain, 3 people were alive who might not have been. Caleb rested his hand on the doorframe, feeling the grain of the wood, the solidity of it. He did not think about the life he had walked away from. He thought about the one that had found him anyway. Inside, the cabin waited. Outside, winter held its distance, for now. The days that followed did not announce themselves as a turning point. They arrived quietly, one after another, each shaped by small, practical demands that left little room for reflection. Snow still fell, though less violently now, settling into the grooves of the ridge as if learning its contours by touch. The storms moved through in shorter bursts, and between them, the air grew brittle and clear, revealing a sky so sharply blue it felt almost fragile. Caleb's body felt the cost of the last rescue once the adrenaline drained away. His knee swelled overnight, stiffness radiating up into his hip. He wrapped it tightly, took measured steps, and adjusted his pace without complaint. Pain had become another piece of information to manage, no different from wind direction or daylight. Briggs stayed close, watching him with a quiet attentiveness that bordered on insistence, as if reminding Caleb that efficiency did not require self-neglect. By midweek, Hollow Creek could no longer pretend the ridge was just another unoccupied slope. Word traveled the way it always did in small towns, unevenly, carried in pauses and half-finished sentences. People didn't come to thank Caleb so much as to confirm that the light was real. A truck would slow at the base of the trail, someone would look up toward the cabin, then drive on. The acknowledgement was subtle, almost embarrassed, but it changed the texture of the place. The first to come deliberately was Ruth Calder. She arrived on foot just before noon, moving steadily despite the snow, a canvas pack slung over one shoulder. Ruth was in her late 60s, compact and strong in a way that suggested years of practical labor rather than exercise. Her hair, iron gray and thick, was braided neatly down her back, and her face bore deep lines etched by sun, wind, and an enduring refusal to hurry. Her eyes were pale hazel, sharp and kind at the same time, the eyes of someone who had learned how to measure people without weighing them down. "I bake better when I'm worried," she said by way of introduction, setting the pack down on the porch. Inside were 2 loaves of dense dark bread still warm beneath a towel, and a jar of honey sealed with wax. Ruth ran the small post office in town, a position that had made her the unofficial keeper of everyone's business without ever turning her into a gossip. Her husband had died 10 winters ago in a snowmobile accident, and she had learned to live with absence by making sure others did not have to. "Light's been on every night," she added, glancing toward the window. "Figured you'd need to eat." Caleb accepted the bread without ceremony. Gratitude, when offered too loudly, had a way of turning generosity into obligation. Ruth seemed to understand that. She knelt briefly to greet Briggs, fingers sinking into the thick fur at his chest. The dog leaned into the contact, calm and familiar, as if recognizing a steady presence. Others followed in quieter ways. A man dropped off extra fuel cans and left before Caleb could reach the porch. Someone tied a small bundle of dried herbs to the fence post. Sage, juniper, something sharp and resinous. Each offering was modest, unannounced, and precisely what the ridge required. June returned 2 days later, this time without Ash. She came up the trail on snowshoes, movements efficient despite the weight of the pack she carried. The limp she'd hidden before was more visible now, favoring her right knee when she thought no one was watching. She'd earned that injury years earlier during a night extraction that ended too late for the subject, but too early for forgiveness. June had stayed in search and rescue long enough to know when to step away. She hadn't stayed long enough to forget how to come back when it mattered. "I talked to the county," she said once she was inside, gloves drying by the stove. "They won't make this official. Too many rules, too much liability." Caleb nodded. He hadn't expected otherwise. "But they won't stop it either," June continued, "as long as no one starts advertising." "I'm not," Caleb said. June's mouth curved slightly. "I know." She spread a map across the table, marking new routes, circling areas that shifted with wind and thaw. They worked in silence, the kind that came from shared purpose rather than avoidance. Briggs lay nearby, head on his paws, eyes following their hands. That evening, as dusk settled, a knock came at the door. The man who stood outside looked out of place in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Evan Brooks was in his mid-30s, tall and thin, with carefully trimmed facial hair and a coat that had never known snow before today. His hands shook slightly as he removed his gloves, and his eyes darted toward the trees with poorly concealed anxiety. "I was told there might be someone here," he said, voice tight. "I'm not lost. I just needed to stop." Caleb let him in. Yet Evan explained in halting pieces. He'd been driving through Hollow Creek on his way to nowhere in particular, running from a life that had narrowed without his permission, a tech job that had hollowed him out, a recent divorce that left him sleeping in his car more nights than not. When the road iced over and the engine light came on, panic rose faster than logic. Someone at the gas station had mentioned the ridge, the light. Evan stayed only an hour. He drank soup, warmed his hands, and sat quietly while Briggs rested at his feet. When he left, his shoulders were less hunched, his steps more deliberate. He didn't thank Caleb. He didn't need to. The cabin had done its work. Later that night, the radio crackled again, not with distress this time, but with routine chatter. Roads reopening, weather stabilizing. The ridge, for the moment, that was not being tested. Caleb stood alone on the porch, the cold biting cleanly at his face. Briggs sat beside him, posture relaxed but attentive, ears angled toward the forest out of habit rather than alarm. The lantern burned behind them, its light steady and unremarkable. For the first time since he'd arrived, Caleb allowed himself to think beyond the next task. The thought surprised him with its simplicity. He did not imagine leaving. He did not imagine recognition. He imagined continuity, fuel stored, markers replaced, light maintained. He imagined the ridge holding and himself holding with it. Staying, he realized, was not passive. It demanded attention, humility, and the willingness to be changed by what did not belong to you. It asked for less explanation than leaving ever had. Caleb reached down and rested his hand on Briggs's head. The dog leaned in, solid and warm. Inside, the cabin waited as it always had. Outside, winter shifted, testing boundaries, listening for weakness. Caleb did not offer it one. He turned off the porch light briefly to refill the lantern, then set it back in the window, brighter for the coming night. The ridge answered with silence, deep and watchful, as if acknowledging the choice without comment. Spring did not arrive on the ridge the way people like to imagine it. There were no sudden thaws, no triumphant birdsong cutting clean through winter's grip. Instead, the season edged in quietly, testing the ground the same way winter had, carefully, without apology. Snow still fell at night, though it no longer buried the world in one relentless motion. By day, thin veins of dark earth appeared along the southern slope, and the trees shed their weight in small, patient avalanches that sounded like sighs. Caleb noticed the change in Briggs first. The dog still woke early, still took his position by the door when the wind shifted, but the tension had eased by a degree that only someone who lived with him would catch. Briggs lingered longer in the sun when it broke through the clouds, stretching his long frame with the satisfaction of an animal that understood endurance but appreciated mercy. The scar along his shoulder had lightened as his coat shed, pale fur threading through the darker sable like evidence of time passing without erasure. Caleb's knee ached less now, not because it had healed, it never would, but because the cold had loosened its hold. He moved more freely, his stride still careful but no longer guarded. He had stopped counting the days since he arrived. The ridge had absorbed him into its own measure of time, one defined by weather patterns, radio calls, and the steady rhythm of the light being lit at dusk. The cabin had changed too, not structurally, but in the way lived-in places always did. Extra hooks lined the wall for coats that might never hang there twice. A chalkboard by the door held weather notes and radio frequencies, written in Caleb's precise, economical hand. The table bore new marks, rings from mugs set down in a hurry, shallow scratches from maps spread and folded back again. None of it felt like clutter. It felt like record. The call came on a clear afternoon when the sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at. "Ridge Cabin, you copy?" Caleb answered without hesitation. The voice belonged to Thomas Hale, the ranger who had first warned him weeks ago. Tom sounded older now, fatigue roughening the edges of his words. A small plane had gone down west of the spur during a supply run, hard landing, poor visibility on approach. The pilot was alive, but injured. Extraction would be slow. "I'll go," Caleb said, already reaching for his coat. Briggs was on his feet, harness in his mouth, and eyes bright and focused. There was no question in him. There never was. They found the wreckage just before dusk. The plane crumpled awkwardly among young pines, wings bent like broken arms. The pilot, Sam Whitaker, was in his late 50s, broad through the chest, despite the way pain had pulled him inward. His beard was gray and neatly trimmed even now, the kind of man who held on to habits because they reminded him who he was. A fractured leg, a head wound that bled freely but not deeply. He joked through clenched teeth, humor shaped by years of flying routes that demanded respect. "You must be the light," Sam said when he saw Caleb. "Heard about you on the radio." Caleb didn't correct him. Extraction took longer than expected. Night fell fully, stars scattering overhead with indifferent clarity. When they finally returned to the cabin, Sam was stable, bundled and warm. Briggs pressed close, as always. The rescue team arrived later, their relief unspoken but heavy. By the time the engines faded, Caleb was exhausted in a way that reached deeper than muscle. He sat on the porch step with Briggs beside him, the two of them breathing in the cool, thawing air. Below them, Hollow Creek glimmered faintly, lights fewer now as people slept without needing to watch the ridge. Footsteps sounded on the trail behind him. Caleb turned, already cataloging posture and pace. The woman approaching moved carefully, but without hesitation, her boots steady on uneven ground. She was tall, mid-40s, with dark hair pulled back into a practical ponytail threaded with silver. Her face was familiar in a way that tightened something in his chest before his mind caught up. "Mara," he said quietly. She stopped a few steps away, uncertainty flickering across her expression before settling into something calmer. Time had been kind to her in the way it often was to people who face change directly. Her posture was straighter, her eyes clearer. The lines of worry had softened, replaced by something steadier. "I heard about the ridge," she said, "about the cabin, about you." Caleb stood slowly, aware of every movement. Briggs remained seated, watching her with interest rather than suspicion. "I didn't come to ask you to leave," Mara continued, "and I didn't come to stay." She took a breath. "I just needed to see who you became." They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them no longer sharp. Then Caleb thought of the man he had been when she left, always halfway gone, measuring distance instead of presence. He thought of the light burning behind him, of the markers in the snow, of Briggs choosing paths that held. "I stayed," he said finally. "Not as defense, as fact." Mara nodded, eyes shining. "I can see that." They talked briefly, carefully, as people did when they understood that not all endings were failures. Mara told him about her work now, about a life rebuilt with intention. Caleb told her about the ridge, about listening rather than leaving. There was no promise between them, no attempt to reclaim what had already found its place in the past. When she left, she paused to kneel and greet Briggs, pressing her forehead lightly against his. "Good dog," she whispered. Briggs accepted the affection with dignity, tail thumping once. That night, Caleb left the light on longer than usual. Weeks passed, snow retreated in earnest. The ridge revealed its scars, broken branches, worn paths, places where winter had tested resolve. Caleb and June walked the perimeter together one morning, updating markers, planning for the next season. June smiled more now, the tightness in her shoulders easing as if she, too, had found something steady to lean against. One evening, Ruth Calder climbed the trail with a small crowd behind her. No announcement, no ceremony, just neighbors carrying food, tools, spare radios. Someone had painted a simple sign and leaned it against the porch railing. It read, "Light on, you're not alone." Caleb stared at it longer than necessary. He didn't argue, he didn't object, he simply nodded and made room. As dusk fell, the lantern glowed in the window, steady and familiar. Briggs lay at the threshold, eyes half closed, ears still listening. Caleb stood beside him, hand resting on the doorframe, feeling the solid truth of the place beneath his palm. Winter would return. It always did. People would still lose their way. Sound would still lie. Ground would still deceive. But the ridge had a watchman now, not because he had been chosen, but because he had chosen to stay. Caleb did not disappear. He kept the light on. Sometimes miracles don't arrive the way we expect. God doesn't always remove the winter from our lives. He doesn't erase loss, pain, or the long roads that break beneath our feet. More often, God works quietly. He places a light in the darkness. He calls someone to stay, when walking away would be easier. He speaks through small, faithful choices, opening a door, sharing a warm meal, or standing beside someone who no longer has the strength to stand alone. The same is true in our everyday lives. There are moments when we feel lost, exhausted, or unseen. Times when silence feels heavier than noise. But if you are here, listening to this story right now, perhaps you were never truly forgotten. Perhaps God is reminding you that hope still exists, through a kind word at the right moment, a helping hand when you least expect it, or a small light that guides you one step forward. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that kindness still matters and second chances are real, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what has helped you keep going through your hardest seasons. And if stories like this bring you peace, faith, or healing, consider subscribing so we can continue keeping the light on together. May God bless you, protect you, and guide your steps through calm days and heavy storms alike. And when the path ahead grows dark, may you always find a light waiting for you. Amen.